Welcome to this webinar by General HR McMaster. Before we proceed any further, I'd like to introduce the Executive Deputy Chairman of RSIS, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, to share a few welcome remarks. Ambassador Ong, please.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. I hope all of you can hear me well. There is some disturbance in the background. As Professor Kumar just mentioned, welcome everyone. Today we are listening to Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster to talk about the end of the war on terror. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this special web event organized by the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Study in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. General McMaster, as you have read his background in the notice of invitation, is the former National Security Advisor to the President of the United States of America. We are excited to hear from General McMaster at this pivotal point in the fight against international terrorism. As all of you are aware, the United States has announced the formal end of its operation in Afghanistan. The US administration has also reorganized its effort in Iraq. The war against international jihadist terrorism has been the dominant feature of the global security landscape for the past 20 years. While Al-Qaeda is a shadow of its former self, it remains a factor in the terrorism war, and it may use its potential capability to ensure trouble continue in Afghanistan as that country tries to rebuild its government in the coming years. In Southeast Asia and its neighboring region, the challenge posed by extremism and terrorism is a very serious one, even though governments in Southeast Asia and the surrounding areas have made concerted efforts to face and remove the threat. We are delighted to be able to hear General McMaster today. He is a man who has been at the forefront of the fight against terrorism, and he has many experiences to share with us. How do we move forward into the future? What else can we do to tackle the challenges posed by terrorism? We are sorry that we cannot have General McMaster personally here in Singapore, but we will definitely invite him to join us in Singapore as soon as the COVID-19 restrictions are relaxed and travel can be convenient once more. Thank you, General McMaster, for taking the time at the end of your day in California, USA, to share with us your personal views and experiences. And I congratulate you on your recent book, which you have published at the end of your tour of duty with the President of the United States. Without further ado, I will now pass over to Professor Kumar, who will continue this proceeding. Kumar, as you know, is the head of the ICPVTR in RSIS. Over to you, Professor Kumar. Thank you once again, General McMaster. Hope to see you soon. Kumar.
Yep, thanks, Ambassador Ong. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kumar Ramakrishna, head of ICPVTR RSIS. And let me also thank General McMaster for taking time out from his busy schedule to share with us his insights this morning. Just to give you a bit more context, It is well known that General McMaster was a national security advisor to the former US President Donald Trump. But before that, he served as a commissioned officer in the US Army for 34 years before retiring as a Lieutenant General in June 2018. He has seen combat. He has commanded a multinational task force in Kabul, Afghanistan, the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Iraq, and Eagle Troop 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Operation Desert Storm in 1991. He has also served overseas as advisor to the most senior US commanders in the Middle East, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Between 2014 and 2017, General McMaster designed the future US Army as the director of the Army Capabilities Integration Center and the Deputy Commanding General of the US Army Training and Doctrine Command, or TRADOC. As Commanding General of the Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning, he oversaw training and education for the Army's infantry, armor, and cavalry forces. He has also taught military history at the US Military Academy, as well as a graduate course on the history of military leadership for officers enrolled in Columbia University's MBA program. General McMaster is currently the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford University, as well as the Bernard and Susan Leotard Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and lecturer at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He is a widely published author on topics such as leadership, history, and the future of warfare. He's the author of the award-winning book, Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Lies That Led to Vietnam, and more recently, Battlegrounds, the Fight to Defend the Free World. I can share with you this morning that one of the reasons we were very keen to have General McMaster with us is that he has written what to me is a very important book, Battlegrounds, in which he analyzes not just the evolving violent Islamist terrorist threat, but also the wider geopolitical situation in South Asia, as well as the evolving strategic challenge posed by states like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. In fact, I do highly recommend that you go out and get yourselves a copy of Battlegrounds. I'm pretty confident it would provide a great strategic education for you as it did for me. General McMaster will likely be drawing upon some of the insights from that book in this morning's webinar discussion. I'm very pleased to introduce as well the two moderators for this morning's session, namely my two ICPVTR colleagues, Raffaello Pantucci and Abdul Basit. Raf Pantucci is a senior fellow in RSIS and has previously worked at think tanks in London, Washington, and Shanghai, and is very well published in various academic and policy journals. Basit is a research fellow in RSIS and one of the editors of the Counter-Terrorist Trends and Analysis quarterly online journal published by ICPVTR. Basit is a well-published analyst of South Asian terrorism and geopolitical affairs. So we have two astute analysts who are well-placed to guide our session along this morning. Without much further ado, let me pass the time to Raf and Basit to get us going. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Prof. Kumar, and Ambassador Ong for that welcome to this session. General McMaster, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, the way we're going to do this is myself and Basit will put some questions to get the discussion going, and then we'll switch to Q&A. And just to the audience, please use the chat function to ask your questions. So if you type your questions in there, once we've done with some initial ones to get the discussion going, I'll start reading from those and put those to General McMaster. So if you do have any questions, please use the chat function, type them in there, and then we'll put them to the General. But to get us going this morning or this afternoon for you, I wonder if we could go back to something that Ambassador Ong started off talking us about, that we feel that what feels like quite a pivotal moment in the kind of fight against international jihadist terrorism with the announced American withdrawal and what's happening in Afghanistan at the moment. I wonder if we could go back a bit in time and if we could talk a bit about how we actually got here. You know, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what you were doing on September 11, 2001, when the attacks happened in the United States that really kind of triggered the whole series of events that we've seen, you know, dominating the strategic discourse over the past 20 years. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit how we kind of have got to where we are today, and in particular, how this changed your kind of outlook and experience. Thank you. General, you're on mute.
If you're over 50, you have to be reminded to do that, to take yourself with me. Hey, but I just want to begin by saying, hey, it's a pleasure to be with you. I wish I could be in Singapore. I feel like I'm at home because I love RSIS. I've been to a couple of conferences there, and I've enjoyed my time there. And I have fond memories of having a pint with you, Raf, after our long, hard days at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London as well. And I'm a big fan of RSIS because I think RSIS has done more than any other organization to help people understand geostrategic and geoeconomic dynamics, across Asia, but in particular the threat from jihadist terrorism in Asia. And your handbook on the topic, your publications on the topic are these seminal works. So it's a real privilege to be with you. And I feel like I'm at home with you and Professor Kumar and Mr. Bassett. So, I was in Germany. I was in command of an armored cavalry squadron in Schweinfurt, Germany, and we're in the midst of an intense training activity event there, in preparation for conflict broadly. And I remember the first reports coming in of airplanes impacting into the World Trade Center. I thought immediately that this was a terrorist attack. And Raf, I mean, nobody here should know this, but I had written a monograph on really how unrealistic assumptions about the so-called revolution in military affairs in the 1990s had been kind of a setup, a setup for strategic shocks that we encountered in the 2000s, especially the 9/11 mass murder attack. We should remember the most devastating terrorist attack in history, killing nearly 3,000 innocents, wounding over 10,000 more, taking trillions out of the American economy. And what we were set up by is this idea that somehow America's and the West's, advanced societies, technological military prowess had guaranteed our security, well into the future. If you remember, I know some of us are old enough to remember, maybe not you, Raf, but some of us are old enough to remember, the hubristic language of the 90s, right? That we were going to achieve full spectrum dominance over any potential adversaries. And this assumption was related to two, I think, also overly optimistic assumptions about the nature of the post-Cold War period. First, that the arc of history had guaranteed the freedom or the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. And this was associated with victory in the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Ideological competition was over. And then a corollary to that is as the Soviet Union collapsed and of course, China was not really a geostrategic, geoeconomic factor in the 90s. That the belief that this unipolar moment for the United States would last, and then as if powers on the Eurasian mainland landmass did gain strength, that there would be a condominium of nations, right? And we would work together cooperatively on global issues. And so great power competition was also a relic of the past. But then the last of these was that our technological prowess would guarantee our security. And of course, we forgot, an important observation about war that my friend Conrad Crane, a military historian, has made, which is, hey, there are two ways to fight, essentially, asymmetrically and stupidly. And in the 1991 Gulf War, the fourth largest army in the world, Iraq, and under Saddam Hussein, picked stupidly. And I think we learned the wrong lessons from that war. And it was a setup for a terrorist organization who nobody paid that much attention to, Raf. We have to remember, right? Al-Qaeda declared war on the United States. Nobody paid attention. Al-Qaeda, conducted the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. And we paid a little bit of attention to it, but didn't really think that much of it. And then of course we had the embassy bombings in 1998, after which we fired a few cruise missiles, what I would call over the horizon counterterrorism, right? And called it a day. And so we have to remember that our inattention to jihadist terrorist organizations who want to commit mass murder as their principal tactic in a war against all civilized peoples was a setup for that strategic shock on 9/11. And I think we rectified that after 9/11. Some would say, oh, we overdid it to a certain extent in the invasion of Iraq. But, I was in Germany. And then, of course, I immediately focused on preparing our unit to deploy and fight wherever we would have to go when we traced, obviously, Al-Qaeda back to Afghanistan and back to the Taliban, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, who had given Al-Qaeda a safe haven and support base to plan, prepare, resource, train for this mass murder attack?
Okay. General McMaster, you said that it started with Al-Qaeda's attacks on American soil. So since then, how the war has proceeded, and in your sense, what is the current status of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and also its relations with the Taliban, who seem to be on the ascendance as of now. So the various UN reports have come out with saying that despite their guarantees to the US in the Doha Agreement, the two are still closely allied. Not only that they're closely allied, but that relationship has grown further. So what is your sense of Al-Qaeda and how this threat is likely to evolve in the event that US is withdrawing from Afghanistan?
Right. Well, I wouldn't say it started right with Al-Qaeda. I think it started with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's proselytization of a Salafi jihadist ideology that became foundational to jihadist terrorist organizations. This export of this ideology, which I would say I would call it a perverted interpretation of Islam, that leans in favor of a takfirist or takfirin ideology, really gained the most traction during the Mujahideen resistance to Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. And I think we all know, I mean, obviously that it was the alumni, the Afghan alumni, who committed the mass murder attacks of 9/11. And so I think what we have to be concerned about these days, right, is the Al-Qaeda alumni of more recent conflicts, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then morphed into Al-Qaeda in Iraq 2.0, which was ISIS in Iraq. And the other various terrorist organizations are orders of magnitude larger than the Afghan alumni were. And they're interspersed really across large portions of the globe, right? Across Asia, across Central Asia and South Asia, certainly into Europe and across the greater Middle East, North Africa, and down to West Africa and the Horn of Africa as well. And so the problem is much larger. And to get to the second part of it, and it didn't begin with 9/11. It was a threat that was growing. And that grew while we were inattentive to that threat for too long, and I would say that it's growing stronger, right? Because of a number of reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, the alumni of ISIS and ISIS Khorasan, Al Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, these groups that tend to operate in terrorist ecosystems, which are now most vibrant along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and had been able to create a safe haven support base in Syria and in Iraq when ISIS was in control of territory the size of Great Britain, have become dangerous because of control of territory and populations and resources, because of the magnitude, as I mentioned, larger than before, because they are trying to get access to more and more destructive weapon systems, destructive capability that we previously associated only with nation states. As we know, they can communicate with each other much better than before and can connect with each other across wide areas, right, from the G5 Sahel, to the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, and to South Asia and into Southeast Asia, and use encrypted communications to do that. And of course they remain determined to commit mass murder as their principal tactic, and remain committed to establish Islamist caliphates, in which they would impose brutal Sharia, and then use those bases to conduct further attacks and expand their control of territory and populations. That's really what they want to do. Their determination to do so is undiminished. And I think one of the fundamental flaws about this withdrawal from Afghanistan is that we tried so hard to disconnect the dots between the Taliban and Al Qaeda that we fell prey to self-delusion there. And as the June 2021 report, which I think you alluded to, the UN report, showed that, and many other sources have shown in an incontrovertible way, that Al Qaeda and the Taliban are inexorably intertwined, right? I mean, if you just read Al Qaeda's newspaper, right, and it's that newspaper shows that they were active in at least 18 provinces at the time of what I would call the U.S. capitulation agreement to the Taliban in 2019. And so we have engaged in an extraordinary degree of self-delusion, what I call strategic narcissism in battlegrounds. And this is our tendency to define even our enemy as we would like our enemy to be, rather than to confront an actual enemy, an enemy in which Siraj Haqqani is the military commander of the Taliban, and is one of the key bridges between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. We neglect, the huge trove of documents that we uncovered in the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Documents that show that it was Al Qaeda and the Pakistani ISI that helped the Taliban to regenerate after 2001, and they've been utterly intertwined since then.
This is a fairly bleak picture in a way you painted of where we're sort of getting to.
No, this is just reality. You've heard reality. The optimistic, right? I mean, Raf, if you listen to President Biden's speech on the occasion of the announcement of our complete withdrawal, everything he said is the opposite of reality in that speech, right? And what were the implicit assumptions? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to highlight the self-delusional aspect of the policy. The first is, well, maybe the Taliban will not be as ambitious as they were before, and they'll share power. How's that working out, right? Hey, Ralph, we heard for so long there's no military solution in Afghanistan. Well, it seems as if the Taliban thinks there might be one. The second is that maybe the Taliban don't impose a more benign Sharia in Afghanistan. Well, as they're lining up officials and gunning them down, as they are first accepting the surrender of some units and then murdering them and mutilating their bodies, as they're blowing up girls' schools, attacking maternity hospitals. Okay, well, what is that? What is the more benign version of the Taliban? Is that mass executions maybe every other Saturday? Is that every other girls' school bulldozed? And then the third element was this point that Mr. Bassett brought up, right? That there's this bold line, between the Taliban and Al Qaeda, between the Taliban and other terrorist groups, which is utterly not true as well. And so I think, Raf, that and the final one is that this is really an Afghan problem. It's not going to affect anywhere else. And of course, we know, with the experience of ISIS, we know with the experience of a safe haven existing in Pakistan, that this is where terrorist threats against our own countries emanate from. It's the areas from which they emanate.
I guess I'd be curious to pick up on sort of the final aspect of that, which is, or a kind of aspect within this broader discourse, which is then, well, what do you think has been achieved over the past 20 years in Afghanistan? Yeah. What are the kind of the successes you would point to? And I think you've been pretty clear that you don't think we've disentangled that kind of web of terrorism that is connected out of Afghanistan. Right. But what do you think have we achieved? And has there been any kind of degradation of capability of terrorist groups in general as a result of, the substantial operations that have been done in Afghanistan, which you played no small part in leading at various moments?
Absolutely, there has been, Raf. If I had told you on September 12th, 2001, that we would be talking right today in 2021, and there would not have been another major terrorist attack mounted by jihadist terrorists on U.S. soil in those 20 years, you would have said, there's no way. There's going to be another one, right? One of the reasons why there hasn't been another one is because immediately we removed the safe haven support base provided by the Taliban, and then used our efforts in South Asia, paradoxically, sometimes in cooperation with the Pakistanis, to deny the safe haven support base that is so important for these organizations to gain the kind of strength that they need to conduct large-scale attacks. I think a great example is the failed New York Times bomber, right? Why did he fail? Because he was dodging U.S. counterterrorism efforts and not received the proper training. We also know that it is the exploitation for intelligence purposes of bases of terrorist organizations in these areas that leads to arrests, that leads to law enforcement actions around the globe. Raf, we've gotten so much better defensively, right? We share information in a way that's unprecedented. We've also, I think, made tremendous progress, not only militarily, but from, as I mentioned, a law enforcement and intelligence sharing perspective, but also, I think, from a financial perspective. I mean, there's been growing cooperation with the Gulf states and globally on trying to shut off the illicit financial flows and the ties to transnational organized crime networks that are very important to terrorist organizations. And then finally, I would say there has been progress, halting, reversed progress at times, at isolating these groups from sources of ideological support. You know, I would just go back to, do you remember when President Trump, visited Riyadh, and everybody said, what the heck is Donald Trump doing, visiting Saudi Arabia, right? But if you go back to the speech that the President Trump gave, and then especially the speech that King Salman gave, I think that's a sea change in really the official stance of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and a recognition that we can no longer allow these groups to cloak themselves in a perverted interpretation of Islam, to provide some sort of rationale, a false rationale, false veneer of legitimacy for their criminal and political acts. And so I think there's been tremendous progress, but what it requires, Raf, is a sustained effort. And this is maybe the last reason why I think these groups are in many ways more dangerous today than they were on September 10th, 2001, for all the reasons I mentioned before: orders of magnitude bigger, connected better with each other technologically, seeking some of the most destructive weapons on earth. And finally, because of this narrative of disengagement, right? And so I understand that we want the Iraqis to take the brunt of the fight in Iraq against ISIS, to ensure that ISIS is defeated in an enduring way. But what if those security forces are infiltrated and captured by Shia Islamist militias who are under the control, really, of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps of Iran? And what if those forces are operating in areas in which Sunni Arab communities feel threatened by those same forces, and therefore, again, begin to regard these takfirin and Salafi jihadist groups as patrons and protectors that prevent them from complete evisceration, right? So it is, in many ways, this cycle of sectarian violence that keeps these jihadist terrorist organizations on life support. And to have the enduring defeat of these organizations, I'll tell you, Raf, it's already a multi-generational effort, right? And it needs to be sustained. And I believe the effort was sustainable. I mean, what breaks my heart about Afghanistan is that we'd won. Yes, what had been achieved? Hey, Afghanistan was transformed from the hell that Afghans had to live under the Taliban from 1996 to 2001, or under the Civil War from 92 to 96, or under the period of continued instability and warlordism after the withdrawal of the Soviets in 1988. So, hey, it was a much better place. Now, was Afghanistan Denmark? Was it Singapore? No. But Afghanistan doesn't need to be Denmark or Singapore. It just needed to be Afghanistan. And with 8,500 U.S. troops there, that's sustainable. I mean, that's tough if you're talking about the Ecuadorian army. We're talking about the U.S. Army, 8,500 troops, really taking no casualties. The Afghans bearing the brunt of the fight. And what you're seeing in Afghanistan now is one aspect of what we had achieved there, which was laudable, which was righteous, which is preventing the humanitarian catastrophe now, was more than worth it for that sustained military commitment, I would say, Raf. So heck yes, we've achieved a lot. Look at life expectancy, look at infant mortality, look at education rates, look at the city of Kabul, right, which was 500,000 people, maybe, with a few cars, with maybe 2 phones. Right. And it's a city now we don't even know. Maybe it's 5 million people. Right. It's vibrant. It's under threat from the Taliban. And that's terrible. But look at what we achieved. I mean, Afghanistan has the most freedom of press, freedom of expression of any country in the region. Right. So, I just think, Raf, in the West, in the United States in particular, we tend to engage really well in self-flagellation. Right. And self-criticism. And again, this is our narcissistic nature. We tend to attribute the frustrations and difficulties we're encountering to ourselves, right? Oh, it must be it must be a failed strategy on our part. It must be impossible after the 20 years. I think we just didn't even acknowledge that we had won, and winning required a sustained commitment. That's a completely different narrative than the conventional wisdom. But I think it's the true narrative, and it reflects reality in Afghanistan. And we're seeing the opposite of that sustained commitment today.
General McMaster, I mean, it becomes quite obvious from your remarks, but nonetheless, let me ask it like how likely is a political solution now, given that Taliban have breached the Doha Agreement and they are, running into the cities? And from that, if we zoom out a bit, what does a likely Taliban victory means for the jihadists in the South Asian region, the likes of Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and we also have the affiliate of ISIS in the region? What does it mean for those regional jihadists? What does it mean for ISIS, the nemesis of Al-Qaeda?
The chances of a political settlement that in any way attenuates the Taliban offensive is zero. It's zero, right? And I hear people from international organizations, humanitarian organizations, these are well-meaning people who are calling for a political settlement. These are the same people, Mr. Ambassador, said, there's no military solution in Afghanistan, right? Okay, both remarks are uninformed, because really the essence of strategy is the integration of all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to achieve well-defined goals and objectives. And our efforts politically and diplomatically for so long were utterly disconnected with and contradictory to what we were doing militarily. So go back to 2009 and President Obama's announcement of the troop reinforcement in Afghanistan and announcing the withdrawal at the same time, right? And then giving more details on that withdrawal and then trying to negotiate a settlement with the Taliban. The Trump administration doubling down on that fundamentally, irrational, approach to war, and then the Biden administration really sealing the deal and adding insult to injury by apparently doing everything they could, to strengthen the Taliban on their way out and writing a letter to Ashraf Ghani to do more for peace. I'm like, hey, where's the letter for Hibatullah Akhundzada, right? So I think that what is astounding here is the lack of strategic competence and pursuing policies that cut against the very nature of war, right? So, I apologize for doing this in Singapore, but you can't help it. This is, as my daughters would say, #predictable for an American general, to quote Clausewitz, right? But Clausewitz said, hey, the first duty of the statesman, is to not try to turn war into something alien to its nature. And what we have done in Afghanistan cuts against the very nature of war. I mean, winning in war requires convincing your enemy that your enemy cannot accomplish his objectives through the use of force. Everything we did in Afghanistan, announcing timetables, talking, saying what we would not do in Afghanistan, no longer considering the Taliban an enemy force and not targeting them actively. That cut against really the very nature of war. What did the Taliban do? Why are these northern provinces getting overrun? It's because going back to 2019, as they were sitting across the table with Zalmay Khalilzad, they were stockpiling weapons. They were pre-positioning their army in the north. And we weren't doing a damn thing about it. So I think it is the disconnect between what we're doing militarily and what we're trying to achieve politically that helps explain how this really fundamentally weak organization of the Taliban could gain so much strength really psychologically. And, war is a contest of wills. What does this mean? This is a disaster in the region, right? Lost wars have consequences, and those consequences reverberate, and they will reverberate across South Asia and across Southeast Asia. And as you know, one of the reasons why they reverberate is that the Taliban and the groups to which they will give safe haven in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan if they succeed in taking over the population centers in Afghanistan, these groups are not monolithic or homogeneous. They overlap in a terrorist ecosystem. You mentioned Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a creation of the Pakistani Army's ISI. But it is worth noting that a splinter group from Lashkar-e-Taiba became Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan and turned on the Pakistani government. And a splinter group from Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, became ISIS Khorasan, right? So these groups, what do? They share people, they share resources, and they share revenue at times and expertise, and they're going to become much, much more dangerous. And another reason they'll become more dangerous is this psychological aspect, right? Is that they will create the perception of being on their victorious march, and the passage in the Quran, which alludes to the black flags marching out of Khorasan. So I think we're in for a period of growing threats to all of our countries, and what that's going to entail is even more and more security cooperation. And you talk about the U.S. role and what we've achieved, and Raf, you asked that question. I think we've achieved quite a bit. If you just look at recent efforts in Indonesia, in the Philippines, for example, I mean, that shows you what good security cooperation, intelligence sharing can achieve. And so whereas you hear the mantra in the United States, for those of you who are listening to our press, and hopefully not getting as depressed as I am, but it makes me depressed. You hear the mantra of ending endless wars. Hey, but wars don't end when one side disengages. Jihadist terrorists aren't looking around and saying, oh, hey, the Americans are gone, I guess we'll quit, right? What we have is a situation that demands a sustained effort. And what we're facing is not endless war that the United States can just stop. What we're facing is an endless jihad that requires us to work together in a sustained manner in the near term, right? To keep these organizations on the run, to restrict their resources, to render them ineffective in committing mass murder and other attacks on us. But in the long term, drying up their sources of support, financial, but especially ideological. And that takes all of us working together. And it takes a sustained effort. And heck, in our lifetime, it might be an endless effort, but it's well worth it, I would say.
Thank you for that. And maybe to try to kind of telescope out, and just to give the audience a bit of a heads up, we've got Bas and myself have one more question each that we're going to put to the general, and then I'm going to start picking up questions that are already coming into the chat. We've got some great questions already there, but let me please encourage you to type your questions into the chat box, and then I'll sort of go through them and put them to the general after we finish our initial round. But to kind of telescope out a little bit more from the specific context of Afghanistan and the conflict against international terrorism, I wonder if you could try to place where we are in Afghanistan and the wider conflict against jihadist terrorism into the current international security landscape that's increasingly dominated instead by this kind of great power conflict. One of the reasons I think that the Biden administration has given for why now is this moment to end this endless war, as you discussed, was the idea that the US wanted to focus more attention on great power conflict. The US and China is the most dominant one, but it's by no means the only sort of clash out there. So I wonder if you could try to situate where Afghanistan is now and the threats that we're talking about in international terrorism against this wider international security landscape.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Raf. I mean, this is really what I think a poor logic, right? Is that, hey, we have to disengage, right? We have to disengage from the greater Middle East, from South Asia, to free up assets, right? So we can compete elsewhere. But it just sort of neglects the fact that a whole range of competitions play out in South Asia and across the greater Middle East. And I think what is sad about these pronouncements that we make these days of self-professed war weariness and desire to disengage, I don't really think that reflects American public opinion. I mean, I really think it's the political class who is caught in this echo chamber about it. And what's striking is that we always say, hey, we're leaving. Okay, this time we're really leaving. Okay, now we're really leaving the Middle East. And we never really leave. We never really leave South Asia. But in announcing our departure, we encourage a whole range of hedging behavior, right? In Afghanistan, the hedging behavior was that various groups within Afghanistan looked over their shoulders. Who's got my back? Nobody. Well, I better build up my power base in advance of a post-American Afghanistan. So if a civil war returns, I'm in a position of relative advantage relative to other groups. And so you had a whole range of behaviors like hollowing out state institutions and functions, that the U.S. was trying to build up these power bases and to establish criminalized patronage networks that are tied to the old Mujahideen era elites. You have people who are hedging in all different ways in the Middle East. This is how Putin gets away with what I would call Putin's Potemkin peace plan in Syria, in which he says to the Emiratis and to the Saudis, hey, please write some checks, right? Write some checks to help me rebuild the country I helped destroy. And what I'll do, and this is when he talks in a low voice, and he says this to the Israelis too, what I'll do is, I promise, over time, I'll work to diminish Iranian influence in a post-Civil War Syria. Just keep Assad in power. Just guarantee Russian interests in Syria. It's all a lie, right? Because, Assad is much more reliant on the Iranians than he is on the Russians. But people want to believe it because they're hedging, right? They're hedging against U.S. disengagement. So I think it's really unwise, this self-inflicted, sort of short-termism, when in fact we already have long-term commitments in the region. And then the final thing I would say is that our adversaries will take advantage of the perception of American defeat in South Asia, right? That's already happening. Just look at what these wolf warrior, Chinese Communist Party people are saying, right, about Afghanistan. I mean, it's quite easy to pull it up. Look at what Russia has done in Afghanistan, helping to arm the Taliban. Well, that makes no sense, right? Given the terrorist threat in the Caucasus and so forth, and the terrorist threats that have emanated, from Central Asia on Russia. But Russia, Putin will actually act against the United States even when those actions cut against Russian interests. I describe this in Battlegrounds. It's the old fable of the scorpion and the frog, right? I mean, the scorpion stings the frog, even though his life depends on it, because it's what the scorpion does, right? And then finally, I would say that other hostile states will also try to take advantage of it. And I'm reminded of an analogy. I think we've forgotten this, by the way, that when there was more and more opposition to the American involvement in Vietnam in the 1960s, this is 1967, 1968, just before and after the Tet Offensive, for example, that's when Kim Il-sung said, hey, it's time to attack, South Korea and Americans in South Korea because they seem weak, right? And we forget that in that 1 year, 15 Americans were killed. There were over 300 attacks in South Korea at the time. It became an insurgency. 65 Americans were wounded. Many more South Koreans were killed. There were amphibious assaults, by commandos in South Korea, right? Why did that happen? The perception of American weakness. Now, I think America always rallies when that happens, right? It was the perception of American weakness that encouraged Imperial Japan to bomb Pearl Harbor and launch the centripetal offensive in 1941. Because they thought Americans wouldn't bear the burden, right? That they wouldn't make the sacrifices necessary to penetrate the inner island chain and threaten Japan directly, right? They were wrong about that. North Korea and the Chinese and the Russians, to a certain extent, assumed that America would not defend the Korean Peninsula. The world wouldn't. It wound up being the UN, as Russia was absent from the Security Council at the time, that led to the UN police action on the Korean Peninsula. The Taiwan Strait crises, all three of them, right? China assumed that the U.S. would not respond. We did every time. So, I think our adversaries are wrong to count the United States out, but I do think they will do their best to magnify the perception of American defeat in Afghanistan, and that will actually redound to their disbenefit, but they won't care, right? And they'll be they're already being short-sighted about it. Because I'll tell you, the consequences are profound, right? What you're already looking at is an estimate. This is a lowball estimate of 1.5 million internally displaced people and refugees. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to to Central Asian countries, but mainly they're going to go to Pakistan. Pakistan will become further destabilized, a country which, by the way, has nuclear weapons and already it houses, I think, 22 or so U.S. designated terrorist organizations, right? Where do those refugees want to go beyond that? I mean, they want to go to Southeast Asia. They want to go to Europe, right? So, the problems that start, in places like Afghanistan or in Syria, they don't adhere to, what is often said in the United States, Las Vegas rules, right? What stays in Las Vegas, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, right? Hey, it doesn't, those problems don't stay there. And I think that we all are going to see significant negative consequences that reverberate across, as you're alluding to, great power competition, but also embolden hostile states. And I was saying that includes maybe North Korea even, but certainly Iran.
Okay, so General McMaster, that brings me to the final question before we move to Q&A, which is about, so Afghanistan for a long time remained the epicenter of global terrorism. Al-Qaeda flourished here. We had Taliban emerging out of the Afghan Mujahideen, and now we have new forms of terrorism. But then the focus and the theater shifted to Iraq and Syria for some years. And then the ISIS was defeated in those countries. And now we are seeing the ascendance of the Taliban in Afghanistan, while ISIS has grown in different parts of Africa. So with this Taliban ascendance, do you see this global epicenter of jihadism returning to Afghanistan, or will this be now much more widespread into different parts, some in the Middle East, some in Afghanistan, and some in Africa? Like how the threat generally is going to pan out vis-a-vis the epicenter? Yeah.
Mr. Bassett, I would say yes to both. Yes, it will be a return of an epicenter of terrorism in the Khorasan region or the Afghan-Pakistan border, the Fergana Valley, all the places that were really problematic and remained problematic over the years, but were subdued really by a sustained effort. But as you mentioned, this cancer, has metastasized, across other portions of the world, and this is why it's important to have a sustained effort led, by strong sovereign states that can use capable, legitimate, professional security forces, mainly law enforcement, to ensure that the terrorist threat, no longer poses the threat on such a colossal scale of a 9/11 or 7/7 or really, I think Indonesia is a great example, right? I mean, of course, you had so many, all the high numbers of casualties in years past, oriented mainly on the tourist industry there. A sustained, effective security force effort, multinational partnerships, intelligence sharing. It's working, right? So that's the kind of sustained effort we're going to need. It's not just going to go away. And this whole rationale that, hey, a reason to leave Afghanistan is because jihadist terrorism is also evident and a growing threat elsewhere. I mean, how does that make sense? And if you go to President Biden's speech, he said, yeah, and the terrorist threat has moved elsewhere, and he listed all the regions you've listed, and he's also said South Asia. And I just wanted to say, hey, Mr. President, Afghanistan is in South Asia, right? And as is Pakistan. So I really, I think the answer to your question is yes to both.
Thank you very much for that. And I think, you've answered a really interesting and deep set of questions. And we've got a whole bunch of really good questions that have come in.
I have no strong opinions on any of this, so Raf.
I can tell. This is a very moderate, we're hearing a very flat, neutral view and not, but no, we greatly appreciate the insights. And it's a really fascinating, it's been a fascinating insight and tour. And I love, as a King's College graduate, I love the reference to Clausewitz. So please, more of that by all means. And a couple of the questions have actually picked up on this. So I'll try to touch on them. But to start with, I think a really interesting question which came in actually quite early was, we've talked a lot about the physical domain. We've talked a lot about terrorism, how it's playing out in Afghanistan, how it's linked around the world. I wonder, if you could talk a little bit about the cyber side of the threat. And the question someone's asking is, what do you think of the most recent cyber attacks against US critical infrastructure? And, some people have characterized this as terrorism. And I know the whole discussion about cyber terrorism is one where people say it doesn't exist. It does exist. How do we characterize it? Are we misunderstanding it? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see cyber fitting into this kind of terrorist description. Is cyber terrorism a misnomer? Is it one that's different, or is it a tactic and tool that we see terrorist groups using as well, or is it more state-driven? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that side of the coin.
Yeah, I think cyber terrorism is viable, and I think really, the definition of terrorism is a use of violence against innocents or non-combatants for political purposes, right? And violence can be, I think, it can be physical, to do physical harm, but physical harm can occur in indirect ways, right? If people don't have access to critical life-sustaining infrastructure, right? Whether it is energy or electricity, or healthcare, or electricity that is critical for hospitals to function, for example, transportation networks that if they're disrupted could result in all sorts of catastrophic actions that you can imagine, right? So you can take down an airliner in a whole bunch of different ways, for example. So I think cyber terrorism is an actual category, because I think the definition of terrorism applies to cyber actions that inflict harm on innocents or non-combatants for political purposes. And I do think what we've seen with the most recent attacks on maybe for example, the Colonial Pipeline in the United States, is that at least I used to think about it really certain categories of cyber threats, right? Cyber threats that are directed directly at infrastructure, right? And you think of state actors, hostile states, terrorist organizations that want to, interfere with the operation of a dam or a nuclear site or power infrastructure or transportation infrastructure. And those could be hostile acts by nation states, or they could be terrorist actors engaged in that activity. Think about the 2011, I think, Iranian attacks against the U.S. financial financial transactions with distributed denial of service attacks, or Russia's attacks. I mean, going back to on Estonia in 2007, for example. They could be part, of military or offensive operations. We saw this used for the first time. Russia's attack into Georgia in 2008 was the first time where we really had a conventional military attack using some conventional forces as well, along with cyber attacks. And so that's like a category, right? Cyber for offensive actions against infrastructure and so forth. Then another category is cyber espionage, right? This is typified by the Chinese Advanced Persistent Threat, or APT-10, right, which is been engaged in a sustained campaign of industrial espionage, and may be responsible, as our former director of the National Security Agency said, the greatest transfer of wealth in humankind through the theft of intellectual property and sensitive technologies. And then a third category is criminal activity, right? That involves ransomware. I think what you saw with the Colonial Pipeline is the confluence of all of these, right? Criminal activity that had an impact on infrastructure and was also a threat to economic security, at least certainly. So, and what this puts a premium on is obviously building resilient systems, and it also puts a premium on combining a good offense with a good defense. As you know, Raph, I mean, these cyber actors are more effective and more dangerous these days for a number of reasons. First of all, they're getting better, right? Their skill sets are transferable. I mean, I can't believe that they're not cooperating, they being our adversaries. So I would say China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, at least cooperate on some level, as long as they direct their attacks against us, right? They don't mind transferring some of that expertise. That expertise is being transferred to non-state actors. They're behind now, but they're trying to catch up. And so malign, enemy, adversary, rival cyber actors are getting better. At the same time, that our surface area for attacks is getting larger and larger, right? With the Internet of Things, with movements toward digital currency and the heavy reliance on electronic payments and transactions, as just a couple of examples, right? And we're behind. The other factor is we're just so darn far behind. Because many of our companies, many of our industries, our public utilities, they just weren't incentivized to invest in security, right? I mean, they were incentivized to please their customers and to make a profit, right? And so, but I think that's all shifting, and we're beginning to play catch up. And so you need a layered defense. You need an active layered defense, so you can combine an offense with a defense. To deter cyber conflict, you have to be able to hold assets of value to your adversaries at risk in the cyber domain, mainly, like the United States did as they went after the actors that attacked the Colonial Pipeline and essentially took them down. But there should be other outside of the cyber realm actions taken against them, which we do, right? I think a great example, Raph, is the indictments against APT-10 from December 2018, when I think 12 countries signed up together for sanctions and indictments against individuals and entities associated with Chinese industrial espionage. So, anyway, I think we're awake to it finally, but we're so darn far behind because of the factors I mentioned. And it is an aspect of terrorism that is going to grow in importance. Now, ISIS, as you know, already was very active in a fourth area, I guess you could say, which is cyber-enabled information warfare. And this would include, I think, propaganda and recruiting for ISIS, who became really adept at that in a really unprecedented way. And you're being able to take that down and to go after them. I think we did a pretty decent job. And one of the ways we did it, Raf, frankly, is we dropped 500-pound bombs on their cyber actors in Syria and in Iraq, and which is a kind of a dramatic example of using physical capabilities against a cyber actor when you have the authorities and it's consistent with the law of war and the ethics of war. So hey, I think this is a growth phenomenon. It's going to become, I think, more and more prevalent. Obviously, doesn't take a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution to kind of give you that insight, right? But I do think that we are in a race to catch up at defensive measures, to building resiliency in our systems, developing offensive capabilities, and then ultimately what we want to achieve is a form of deterrence by denial, right? To have systems, the combination of offensive defense, that cyber actors conclude, hey, they just can't accomplish their objectives by going after our critical infrastructure in a way that's going to harm our people.
Thank you for that. I think a really crisp articulation of the kind of wider problem and how it kind of fits in, and the loss of distance in some way between non-state and state in this particular domain, right, which is, I think, a really critical aspect of it.
Well, look at Prigozhin, for example, right? And the IRA, it's another aspect. The use of organized crime networks to do this work also. Yeah.
No, exactly. I think Russia's played a very interesting game in this regard, as well as China. To go back a little bit then and pick up on something which someone's asked about, which I think you articulated pretty clearly, where you think the Taliban-Al-Qaeda relationship stands, and how they haven't really broken that link at all. But I wonder if we do see a Taliban ascendant into Afghanistan, into a sort of position of power, there is some discourse that says, well, maybe, having taken power, they will try to control some of these groups, not wanting to sort of have a repeat of what started 20 years ago in the sort of invasion, their ejection from Afghanistan. So I wonder, could you take us through whether you think there's any chance that the Taliban will try to curtail maybe groups like Al-Qaeda or some of the others that sort of operate within Afghanistan or within Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, use their bases there to try to launch attacks like the one that we saw on 9/11 or others since?
No. I don't think there's any chance at all, and this is a pipe dream, Raf, and then, I hear people now, at the UN and some people in the United States, even our own Secretary of State, and I want these people to succeed, right? I mean, I'm criticizing, President Biden's statements, not because I'm going to be critical of him, but I think that this is really indicative of how self-delusional American policy has been across at least the last 3 administrations, right? So my criticism is meant to really help us wake up to the realities so that we can stop inflicting damage on ourselves and others with unwise policies, right? That's what I really hope to achieve with these criticisms. And I think that what is striking is this idea that, well, the Taliban, we're just going to hold them accountable in the court of international opinion. Does anybody really think they give a damn about that? Does anybody really think that they're going to be embarrassed, right, by extinguishing women's rights? They're conducting a massive assassination campaign, Raf. They try to attribute these attacks to others, but they gunned down expectant mothers and infants in a maternity hospital, Raf, right? I mean, so really, do you think they're going to be embarrassed, in such a way that they're going to alter their behavior and become more responsible? It is the ultimate in strategic narcissism and self-delusion to think that the Taliban will not continue to be driven by the ideology, the emotions, and the aspirations they have for their Islamic emirate, as they have been in the past.
Thank you for that. I'm going to try to merge a few questions together because we've got a lot that have come in and some that are kind of touching on similar subjects. And I think, a question that a number of people have asked, I think, of in part drawing on your experience as a senior officer serving really at the foreground of this kind of counterinsurgency discourse, both in terms of your writing and in terms of your practice on the ground. And I wonder, if you look back at the last 20 years in the war on terrorism, what is kind of one thing you think the US did well in the conduct of this conflict, and one thing that should have been done differently. And then sort of piling on top of this, do you think that there is, the US has, and you particularly have written about the conflict in Vietnam, and I know you've studied sort of war more generally in great detail. And did the US learn anything from the practice of the counterinsurgency in Malaya and the experiences in Vietnam that were missed, that weren't translated properly into the current context of fighting the conflict on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq and in other places?
Gosh, now you're going to really depress me, Raf. So I mean, I'm a historian, man, and I mean, why study history if you don't think it can get have some benefit, right, in terms of informing your decisions and actions today, and I do believe that understanding of how the past produced the present is the first step of making projections in the future. I do believe in a reasoning by historical analogy, not to give you the answers, right? Because all of these situations that you mentioned, counterinsurgency, whether it's in Malaysia or Vietnam or Algeria, wherever, right, or Thailand, or I mean, is fundamentally different, right, based on the unique social and political, economic dynamics, historical memory, and emotions and aspirations and ideologies that drive and constrain the various actors, right? So I mean, there's only so much you can do with historical analogy, but what I believe history can do is at least help you stop making the same mistakes, right? And so, I write about this in the conclusion of Battlegrounds, in how, when I was a cadet at West Point, nobody talked about Vietnam, Raf. Nobody talked about it. And the reason they talked about it is because, the American military felt burned by the experience, right? And what we wanted to do, really, as much for an emotional cathartic as for any other reason, is to move on to something bigger, right? And that's the race to improve military capabilities, to deter and, if necessary, respond to aggression from the Soviet Union. And one of the catalysts for this kind of movement, this reform movement, really, Raf, which was a renaissance in the military, in the American military, in the late 70s and through the 80s. Was the Arab-Israeli War, 1973 war, when a study group went over there to study that war. And this is Don Starry, and laid out really a whole program for at least the Renaissance in the Army, but that caught on to the other services as well. So we learned some lessons, right? But we really were engaged in forgetting Vietnam, avoiding Vietnam, and I think that this has been a streak through our institutional culture in the military, but also our political culture that remains strong through the 90s, right? The Gulf War reinforced that idea. Hey, it was a relatively, it was a large scale, but it was cheap because of burden sharing. It seemed to be a decisive war. But heck, Raf, we learned the wrong lessons from that war, right? Because we forgot, A, we're fighting Iraqis under Saddam, right? Who fought in a spirited way, but were inept in their strategy. And B, the political objective was narrowly circumscribed. It was status quo ante, right? Turn Kuwait back to the Kuwaitis. And so then we sort of developed this, as I mentioned, this orthodoxy of the revolution of military affairs in the 90s, which was a setup. So we learned the wrong lessons there. And that was a setup for the difficulties. And I would say some of the difficulties, there was always going to be difficult, but the unanticipated length and difficulties in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So, I mean, everybody wants to talk about, should the United States have done it, right? It is the attack into Iraq, right? I mean, of course, we had to invade Afghanistan after 9/11. I mean, that was a that was a foregone conclusion and wholly justified by I think from any reasonable perspective. But I think what we ought to debate about Iraq and Afghanistan is who the hell thought it would be easy, and why did they think it would be easy? And so, to answer your second question first, what we didn't do is we give it enough attention to what it takes to consolidate military gains into sustainable political outcomes, and to put a political settlement that is consistent with what brought you into that conflict to begin with, as the foundation for an integrated strategy that integrates, again, all efforts, right, toward achieving that political outcome. And we didn't do it. And a corollary to that is we took a short-term approach to what were fundamentally long-term problems, right? And we underwhelmed both efforts. Now, I still think it was always going to be hard, but we made it much harder on ourselves than it had to be. What went well? I would say the tactical adaptations to fighting terrorist organizations. I think we did that extremely well, not just in the military, right? But I would say in the intelligence community, in the financial community, and with financial actions oriented on drying up illicit financial flows and flows to not only now jihadist organizations, but also those who lay the ideological groundwork for them. I think that's a story of tremendous adaptation. But I think sadly, when we talk about Afghanistan, Raf, the mantra is, hey, it's 20 years, man, we're still there. You're right. I mean, we got to leave, but it has not been a 20-year war, right? It's been a 1-year war fought 20 times over. So I would say that we didn't learn some of the fundamental lessons from Vietnam. That to ensure the freedom and independence of South Vietnam took a fundamentally a political strategy. Did we learn from Malaysia? What should we have learned from Malaysia? Is, hey, it's not about the capability of your security forces. It's about the legitimacy of your security forces. It's not about the capability of just an army. It's the capability of an army and a police force tied to a rule of law and a judicial system. I think that's the main lesson from Malaysia, right? Is that unity of effort, right, across security forces and in the judiciary with a political strategy. And so I don't think we learned and applied lessons the way we should have, we could have. And I think that's because we are ignorant of history oftentimes, or we study history only superficially and therefore abuse it, which sometimes can be even worse, right? An example of that is, Afghanistan, man. I mean, the graveyard of empires, right? I mean, it's just inevitable, it just completely misframes, the nature of our engagement in Afghanistan, really on behalf of an elected Afghan government and an Afghan people who the vast majority did not want the return, of the hell of the Taliban, right? But in not paying attention to the political settlement there, in not trying to forge, right, a multi-ethnic, multi-tribal, consensus about the future of Afghanistan, what did we do instead? We said, oh, we're leaving. We reinforced their particularistic agendas, right, to help divide them even more, and then went to talk to these jackasses in Doha, Qatar, and put our diplomatic effort there, right? Who obviously, are completely disconnected for, they're just front men for. They're the shop window for the really decisive arm, the military arm of the Taliban, which is run by Siraj Haqqani. So, I mean, I could go on about this, but I don't think we learned the right lessons. And sadly, I think we're learning the wrong lessons again, Raf, right? So if you agree with me, which you don't have to, nobody has to, right? But if you agree with me that part of the problem in Afghanistan and Iraq was a short-term approach to long-term problems, that's what we've concluded is, we're just going to do short wars from now on, right? We're just going to do military stuff and then leave. Well, you know what that's called? That's called a raid, right? That's called a military operation for limited purpose, short duration, and planned withdrawal. That's not a war, right? We have, in the words of Conrad Crane again, who's great at these pithy sayings, he has a great long essay, by the way, that I recommend called "Avoiding Vietnam," which makes this point. And he essentially says we have never been able to never do it again. The other book I recommend on this topic is Nadia Shadlow, who I think Raf, and she was the lead author of the National Security Strategy in December 2017. A great historian in her own right. She wrote a book called War and the Art of Governance. And in this book, she has chapters, each a combined chapter on Iraq and Afghanistan. But she looks at really the long history of U.S. intervention and then how necessary it has been across our history to consolidate military gains into sustainable political outcomes. And she calls our penchant for forgetting those lessons in between wars as American denial syndrome, right? And so it's a great question. I think these wars are important because of the outcomes of the wars, right? And we're seeing a disastrous outcome now. We're seeing in dramatic fashion what our forces were preventing there, right? And what the importance of a sustained commitment was. But I think wars are important because really based on the lessons you learn from them. And I think we're also at risk of learning exactly the opposite lessons of what we ought to be learning.
Thank you. to kind of build a bit on this question of perceptions, and I think you made the point very cogently, and I know it's in your book as well, this idea of strategic narcissism that the US suffers from not recognizing victory when it's there and saying, oh, it's all our own fault. But I think when we're looking at the conflict in Afghanistan and on the ground, there is often a great concern about civilian casualties, about people getting killed and innocent people getting killed, or if we think about drone strikes or tactics like that are deployed, in which unfortunately there are casualties that are not necessarily the intended military ones. And this is a narrative that we see adversaries of the United States use against the United States to some degree because they reflect a sort of public opinion and perspective. And we've seen China in particular has kind of picked up on this narrative and uses it to say that we are offering a different vision of international relations. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit on that. And then also, while we're kind of on the subject of China, to pivot ever so slightly, recently we have seen the Chinese engaging, they've been engaging in Afghanistan for some time, but we've seen Wang Yi meet with Mullah Baradar in a very prominent way in Beijing, which was a new thing for.
Yeah, that's
for
a real
Chinese
fun
in
crowd.
particular.
That's a real fun crowd right there, Raf. That's a cocktail party I'm really sorry to have missed, I mean, right there.
Well, I suspect it would have been a dry one. So, but I wonder if you could, what are your thoughts on sort of how China is engaging here, and then China more broadly using this narrative in the public discourse? And is there something the US could have done to blunt that particular narrative in particular?
Well, I mean, just look what's happening on the ground, right? I mean, just look what's happening now, right? And what you're seeing is what US forces have prevented from happening across 20 years. Actually, liberating the Afghan people, and I don't use that word lightly, from the hell of Taliban rule, right? Why did Kabul grow from a city of 500,000 to a city of 5 million? Because people came back, right, to Afghanistan once the Taliban was gone. Look at all the indicators that I mentioned before, right? We have to do better at highlighting that and just give people access to the story. I think what happens is our adversaries, our enemies are very good at playing into our own penchant for self-loathing and self-flagellation, Raf. And this is really a manifestation, I think, of the new left interpretation of history, which is prevalent in our friend Kishore Mahbubani's writings, right, in which he blames the West for everything and apologizes for the Chinese Communist Party, who has demonstrated, right, its benevolence, right? I mean, Xi Jinping in his commemoration of the party's 100th anniversary, focuses on the century of humiliation, but he doesn't talk about the century of suffering, right, and horror associated with the Chinese Communist Party's rule, right? I mean, nowhere do you see, any talk about the great leap forward, and the tens of millions who perished, or the Cultural Revolution, right? Or the massacre at Tiananmen Square, right? I mean, those are not being commemorated this year. And so, Xi Jinping, I think, understands, more than anybody, right? In a really kind of Leninist sense, what Orwell wrote about, right? That he who controls the present, controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future, right? And so I think we should not let him get away with it. Maybe that might be a place to start. And when the Chinese Communist Party leadership says, "Oh well, we would never try to impose our will or our policy on others," I mean, just look at the poster children associated with this, and I would include, this is of course the American saying for the typical example of this. How about Cambodia? I mean, who wants to move to Cambodia? How about Zimbabwe, right? How about North Korea, right? I mean, it's a club. Again, this is a cocktail party I just don't want to go to, Raf. Do you know what I'm saying? And what you have is really, since the Chinese Communist Party, really foisted COVID-19 on the world, right? Regardless of whether you believe it came out of a lab or not, their behavior in really going after and suppressing anybody who was trying to ring the alarm bells about the pandemic. These are doctors and journalists and so forth. And then adding insult to injury with wolf warrior diplomacy. How about bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier? How about a major campaign of industrial espionage on our pharmaceutical companies, like in the midst of a pandemic? How about the campaign of economic coercion against Australia? How about, the South China Sea, right? And destroying ecosystems there, weaponizing those islands, giving their Coast Guard orders and Navy to shoot, right, at anyone who doesn't acknowledge China's ownership of the ocean, right? Ramming and sinking Vietnamese vessels, I mean, the threats toward Taiwan, Japan Senkakus, right? I could go on, right? Okay, so, hey, why is there sympathy for Xi Jinping, and for wolf-warrior diplomacy when they cast these aspersions against the United States and the West? And you see in dramatic fashion that the U.S. was on the side for humanity. Now, were civilian casualties incurred? Yes. Were they consistent with the law of war? Most times, and they were regrettable. But I think when you go back to that question of civilian casualties, who is really inflicting casualties on the Afghan people now, right? Who has used mass murder attacks against innocents as a principal tactic throughout the war, right? I mean, just look at the whole history. Look at the UN reports on civilian casualties, right? Look at reality is what I would say, Raf. And I think we ought to just reject now this orthodoxy of the new left interpretation of history. Man, it came into fashion during the Vietnam War. I know it has a great deal of traction in Singapore and other places because of the very understandable reaction against colonialism and the legacy associated with that carries with it at times, an anti-Western bias. But I would tell you now, in today's world, man, the choice is not between Washington and Beijing. And when Kishore and others talk about like the Indians making love or war and people getting trampled, that kind of BS metaphor, that suggests moral equivalency, I would just say, Raf, the choice today, and I think Singaporeans know this, the choice is not between Washington and Beijing. It's between sovereignty and servitude. And I think the people who have made that most clear is the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, remember when Yang Jin-shi, when he went to APEC, I think it was APEC or ASEAN. Gosh, when was this, man? Was it 2013? Yeah, and he said, hey, we're a big country, you're little countries. Get used to it, right? He brought that same message now to Alaska. They rolled out the same, jingoistic rhetoric with when Wendy Sherman visited there. So I think that ought to be a cause for concern, Raf, and I think it's a cause that we ought to all rally around. And not in a way that we want to that we think that we ought to just move to confrontation with China. But I don't think if we don't work together now and stop, I think, underwriting our own demise with favorable financial relationships with China that I think are essentially covering the cost of their nationalistic agenda and their willingness to take financial loss for strategic gain. If we don't restrict, the transfer of intellectual property and sensitive technologies, if we don't confront, the debt trap and the predatory lending practices that are continuing, globally, that we're going to wind up, our children are going to wake up in a world that is much, less free, less prosperous, and less safe, right? So I would say, it's time to stop, right, tolerating the moral equivalence and engaging, in kind of the self-flagellation and self-loathing that I think are so prevalent, man, in my own country, and then across, nations that do enjoy freedom and prosperity. And so the old saying attributed to Lenin, I'm sure it's not, it's apocryphal, but it's too good not to quote, right? Which is, hey, the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we'll hang them. I mean, we're actually doing worse than that, man. We are financing China's purchase of the rope so they can hang us.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious of time, and we've probably got about 10 minutes left, so I think we'll probably be able to get at least a couple more. So I'm going to try to merge again a few of the questions that have come in, and I apologize in advance to our audience that I'm not going to probably get to all of the questions. We had a lot come in, some that I think are covering ground we've already covered, but others which unfortunately I'm not going to get to. But I think what I wanted to pick up on was, while we were talking about China, if we could tie it back into the discussion, and as you point out, the meeting in Tianjin between Mullah Baradar and Wang Yi would have been an interesting one to attend and participate in. But there is a question about what do you think is going to be the impact of whatever the end state is of, let's say, a Taliban-controlled or heavily Taliban-influenced government in Afghanistan? What kind of a threat do you think that will pose back to China in particular.
Yeah.
Right. And how do you think, because one of the comments that came out recently, I think Secretary of State Blinken mentioned, that China's potential involvement in Afghanistan, I think it was comments he made either around the time of Wang Yi's meeting, I can't remember if it was before or after, saying that, this was, potentially a good thing for Afghanistan. And do you think this is the beginning of a pathway towards China becoming a kind of more responsible stakeholder? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that kind of interaction between China and Afghanistan and how you see that particular relationship playing out going forwards.
Yeah. So what does China want? I mean, I think what China wants is exclusionary primacy, area of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region. And the way to do that is to create servile relationships and dependencies across, across Asia and then into South Asia. And so I think what you're going to see is China regarding the Taliban mainly as a threat to its effort to create those exclusionary areas of economic primacy, military primacy eventually, through kind of efforts associated with, mining in Afghanistan to help give them the ability to dominate, global supply chains that are essential to the emerging global economy, right? Rare earth metals, for example, that are critical to battery manufacturing and renewable sources of energy. But then also threats to some of their biggest projects, like the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. But what's going to happen is what you already saw happen a week and a half ago in Pakistan, which the attack that killed 12 Chinese, sadly. There's going to be a huge backlash against it. What China's been able to do is use what I describe in Battlegrounds as a campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment, right? Co-opt countries and companies with payoffs, right? I mean, the new vanguard of the Chinese Communist Party, right, is a party official and a party bank official with a duffel bag full of cash. But co-opt with, access to the Chinese market, Chinese investment, loans, and so forth. But hey, once you're in, then to use that dependency for coercive purposes, right? You've seen this against South Korea. You've seen it against Australia, right? They're trying to kill one to scare 100 in Australia. Well, it'll scare all of us, right? And to making sure we don't become dependent on China from an economic perspective. And then to conceal this kind of coercive power and coercive acts as just normal business practice. Well, I would say it's a new form of colonialism, essentially. But you know what? You know who's not going to get the word on that? Jihadist terrorist organizations. The Taliban, I don't think, will get the word on that. And so China is already creating a multi-generation security problem for them because they're engaged in a campaign of genocide against the Uyghurs. I mean, anybody who doubts that, right? Uyghur birth rates are down 60%, right? And just look at the sustained effort to extinguish the culture. Do you think that might create a backlash? I think possibly, right? And so China is already the author, I think, is already authoring future security threats and doing their best, right, to strengthen future jihadist terrorist organizations that are going to be oriented on China. Now, I don't wish that on China, but China is sowing the wind. They're likely to reap the whirlwind associated with that. And so I think that's their future. I think they're trying to hedge against it by developing these relationships. But I don't think it's going to do them a damn bit of good. I think what would do them some good is to end this campaign of slow genocide, and to actually jettison this ethnocentric, Han-dominated, jingoistic agenda that is afflicting not only Uyghurs in Xinjiang but all sorts of minorities across China.
Thank you for that. And, I'll switch to the final question now. And, within this, of course,
I'm saying what they should do is adopt the Singapore model. And I know Singapore has some friction in recent weeks and months, but the way Singaporeans have handled it, I think, is laudable. I just wanted to mention that. And I think Singapore remains, to use the American metaphor, a shining city on the hill, right? For religious tolerance, which is, again, an essential ingredient for ultimately defeating jihadist terrorist organizations.
Well, thank you for that. I know I have colleagues on this call and who I work with at RSS who work very powerfully at the front line of dealing with exactly the issues that you're talking about. So I know it's much appreciated to hear that, and I certainly hope that in China people do try to learn from this particular experience to try to make the country a more harmonious place for all of its minorities. But to end kind of back where we started, in a way, talking about jihadist terrorism and how it's been fought over these past 20 years. I think one of the things that may surprise some, I don't think surprised others, was the kind of reemergence in the wake of the Arab Spring of ISI at, Islamic State of Iraq as ISIS, as this big organization's kind of resurgent model. And then, we had the approach of trying to contain and deal with that particular terrorist group, successfully or not. We're still juggling that one. In Afghanistan, we withdraw now, and we're going to see how the chips play out there. I wonder if we could, draw on your experience in fighting these wars, in leading these conflicts, to give us a sense of, if we look into the future, I think it's probably an unfortunate likelihood that we're going to see some sort of jihadist problem reemerge again somewhere around the world at some point in the not too distant future. What's the kind of model of response that you would say we should be preparing to deal with that problem when it sadly, probably, inevitably reemerges somewhere around the world? And is there a broad characterization you would give for what we should be doing to prepare for that, and what ultimately that should look like going forwards? And given this is probably going to be a final answer, very aware that it's your evening there, and I'm sure you have a lovely dinner waiting for you, or at least a digestive drink before you go into it. If you have any other final thoughts you want to leave with us before we conclude this really wonderful webinar, over to you.
Well, I think, Raf, what we want to do is prevent these groups from gaining greater strength, right? And I think the way to do that is to ask a series of questions, right? What is this particular organization? What is its objective? What is its strategy? Recognize that these groups are not monolithic or homogeneous, right? They overlap and so forth. And then I think understanding the strategy of these groups is really important, because we want to, in a Sun Tzu kind of way, defeat their strategy. And the way to do that is then to begin, only if you understand what their strategy is, to begin to map these networks. And I think what we have to do is work internationally, not only to map the terrorist networks themselves and nodes in those networks that have to do with their terrorist and murderous capabilities, kidnapping capabilities, assassination, ability to commit mass murder attacks and so forth, but also those who sustain them. Who are those inside of licit organizations, governmental and non-governmental, who give them cover for action and provide them with financial and other sources of support, including ideological support. And that's when we can begin to interrupt flows through these networks of people, money, weapons, narcotics, recruits, and then we can also ask the payoff questions, right? What are their sources of strength and support? How do we isolate them from sources of strength and support? And how do we go after vulnerabilities? I know that sounds very operational and tactical, but just to give a few examples, Pakistan has to stop going after these groups only selectively. Pakistan has to stop using terrorist organizations as an arm of their foreign policy. Who has influence over Pakistan? China. How can it be in China's interest to allow this to continue to happen? What are the frank conversations that Wang Yi is having with the Pakistani army, besides Baradar, and Mullah Baradar? How about the United Arab Emirates, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Qataris, who help keep Pakistan solvent financially? What about telling Pakistan, hey, the gig is up. We're no longer supporting you unless you drive support for these groups. Now, that's just one example of many, but I do think that there are ways to act on this problem from the outside in that can help reduce really the strength of these organizations. While we've lost, even though we've lost the inside out capability that we had in Afghanistan and on the Pakistani border.
Thank you very much for that, General McMaster. It's been a huge pleasure and an honor to welcome you to this webinar, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us all today. A very brief message to our audience. I would please encourage you all to do the survey, which you should see circulating straight after we end the webinar. It's really helpful to us to get a sense of how the event is going, what you liked, what you didn't like about it. It really helps us in terms of planning future events. So please, I would encourage you all to do that. I know there's lots of you on the call. Just take on another 2 seconds to stick around and do that. But before you do that, let me add my thanks again to General McMaster for taking the time again to speak to us today. His book, Battlegrounds, which captures, I think, a lot of this territory, but I also highly recommend his earlier book, actually, Dereliction of Duty, which is a fantastic book about the sort of war in Vietnam and some of the mistakes that have been made around it. And I think you can see a lot of the thinking that went into that particular book kind of comes through into Battlegrounds Abound. And both of them I know are available in bookshops. I'd encourage you all to go out and purchase it.
And Raf in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean now as well.
Even better. So we don't even have to read it in English if you don't want to. Has it been translated into Bahasa and Tagalog, I suppose is the question. For,
not yet, but hey, there's whoever wants the contract, it's open. It's open.
Okay. Well, you've cast a hook out there for our audience, so hopefully someone will pick up on it, and we'll look forward to seeing it in bookshops across the region as well. But again, thank you very much, General McMaster. It's a real pleasure to welcome you for the morning here today, for the evening for you in California. We very much hope, as Ambassador Ong mentioned at the beginning, that we can welcome you back to Singapore when normality returns, but we're delighted that this strange world that we're now stuck in means that you are still able to join us through this webinar for this really wonderful discussion. So thank you all very much.
Yes, General, we look forward to see you in Singapore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ong. Thanks to you and Raf and Professor Kumar and Mr. Bassett and the great organization of RSIS. What a privilege it's been to be with all of you. Thank you so much.
Well, stay well, keep well. Look forward to see you soon.
Thanks.
Thank you,
everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.